Do you want to heal from trauma but find it difficult to move forward? Do you find that your sympathetic nervous system hijacks you and derails your healing? Do you often feel fatigued or lethargic? Do you feel like you are plagued with chronic anxiety? Have you got a history of trauma, whether small trauma or a big trauma? Do you experience ongoing emotional dysregulation? Do you struggle with meditation, yet appreciate and want its benefits? Do you want to learn to live a healthier and more integrated and fulfilling life? If these questions resonate with you, you might find this video helpful. Now, in this video, I will talk about three key concepts: the stress state versus the healing state, acute stress and chronic stress, big T or big trauma versus small t or small traumas, and how the maladaptive stress response works, and finally, how to actually reset your nervous system. But before I go any further, I'd like to emphasize that the very first thing and most important thing about healing from trauma is to be gentle with yourself. Now, in order to address these questions, we must first pay some attention to the first key concept, that is the two important states, the stress state and the healing state. Now, as many of you may know, trauma is held in our physical and emotional bodies, and that psychology also plays a big part in our physical bodies. And this is where the maladaptive stress response cycle gets created. It's undeniable that the mind always impacts the body. Now imagine you caught a whiff of jasmine as you stroll past someone's garden. And notice how your mood changes, even though it's very, very slightly. You might stop, you might even look around and try to identify where it's coming from. You might even maybe nod to yourself or form a tiny little smile. I mean, this is a subtle example, but it makes the point as to how your mind has significant power over your actions and therefore your healing. It's important to get the support that we need at the time it is needed. And this is a crucial part of the healing process, although we do acknowledge and recognize that a lot of the times when we've got some emotional pain or some traumas, it takes us some time to actually address it and try and heal ourselves. But back to my original point, it is important to try and get the support and the help that we need as soon as we can. So if you think about keeping your cut or your wound clean, and perhaps medicating it as soon as it happens, you do that because you know that your body knows how to heal itself, and it is also your job to prioritize and optimize the environment for healing, which is why you clean it and you try and medicate it. Although we have to face it, we have to face that negative events aren't always avoidable. It's part of life, whether we are being followed in a street by some inconspicuous characters, whether we're watching our child or our elderly parent fall down, or if we are witnessing a fatal accident. The question we should ask is not, why do bad things happen, but why am I not healing from them? Well, one big reason might be because we're not putting ourselves in an optimal healing state, or that we're not addressing our traumas when it needs to be addressed. All these incidents I described involve a cortisol surge in our body as a response, which the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for. So we experience an elevation of cortisol. A blood flow immediately fills our heart and lungs in preparation for fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So fawn is when you immediately try to appease the situation in order to avoid conflict. So you're backing down or surrendering or negotiating with the other party. Now, these incidents don't only affect us physically, they affect us emotionally as well. And we have to provide ourselves with the right conditions for our internal bodies to heal. This is where, you know, two people can witness a horrific accident and one might end up more traumatized than the other. There are empirical studies showing that stress and trauma affects our body's natural healing capacity. So this is not new information, particularly amongst family caregivers who tend to be under chronic stresses of caregiving. Now let's look at the next concept, acute stress and chronic stress. Now, chronic stress is not what our body has evolved for. It's evolved for acute stress. For example, pushing yourself at the gym or meeting a deadline. Acute stress pushes us towards growth physically and psychologically. Evolutionarily, it ensures our survival. So think about primitive man being chased by a cheetah. We very quickly need to figure out how to get out of there and save ourselves to ensure our survival. The next concept we're going to address is big T and small t. Now, this is a really important one because trauma has two main categories. Big T traumas are events that are most commonly associated with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. These are things like serious injuries, sexual violence, or life-threatening experiences. Now, threats of serious physical injury, death, or violence can cause intense trauma, even if the person is never physically harmed. So just the threat itself can be highly traumatic, and witnesses to big T trauma events are also affected. They are also vulnerable to PTSD, especially those who face emotional shock very regularly, like paramedics, therapists, firefighters, police officers, and we call this vicarious trauma. Now, small T traumas, they are highly distressing events that affect individuals on a personal level, but they don't fall under the big T category. Examples of small T trauma include non-life-threatening injuries, emotional abuse, death of a pet, bullying or harassment, the loss of significant relationships like the death of a loved one or a divorce. And it's important to remember that people have unique capacities to handle stress, and this is called resilience. Resilience impacts our ability to cope with trauma. What is highly distressing to one person may not cause the same emotional response to somebody else. So the key to understanding small T trauma is to examine how it affects the individual, how it affects you, rather than focusing on the event itself. Now, although small T traumas may not meet the criteria of PTSD diagnosis, these events can be extremely upsetting and cause significant emotional damage, particularly if the person or yourself might experience this event more than once. Or these events continue to occur during important periods of brain development, like in early childhood and adolescence. And studies have shown that repeated exposure to small t traumas can cause more emotional harm than exposure to a single big T traumatic event. So small chronic traumas that continue over time can be more devastating in effects than experiencing one giant accident, for example. Empathy and acceptance for the impact of small traumas can be hard also because of the common misconception that these events are less significant than the life-threatening emergencies. And when we minimize or don't pay attention to the impact of these small t incidents, we can actually create maladaptive coping behaviors, such as bottling up the emotions or attempting to manage these symptoms without support. When we fail to address such emotional suffering of any traumatic event, the damage can accumulate over time. So suddenly, after so many years, you might end up finding yourself that you're too tired for life. You can't see much joy, or you can't clear your mind because you're too anxious all the time. And this means that you are in a maladaptive stress response cycle. For the body to get into healing, it needs to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. But chronic stress and illness or chronic pain keeps us in this sympathetic nervous system where it doesn't need to be. So we can't actually heal when we need to heal. And that is what is called the maladaptive response, stress response. And adaptive basically means that our body shifts gear in order to cope, but maladaptive behaviors or systems stop you from adapting to new or difficult circumstances. So in a nutshell, with a stress overload, whether traumatic or chronic and accumulative, the maladaptive stress response kicks in, which renders your body handicapped of its physical and emotional natural resources. And so our healing state is inhibited. And this happens on a cellular level, as well as within our organs. So the loop can affect your weakest link. And if that is your digestion, then your gut suffers, or your sleeping patterns, and even slow down wound healing or recovery from illnesses. In fact, Dr. Karazian's book, Why My Brain Isn't Working, Why Isn't My Brain Working? He claims that stress actually atrophies the brain. It shrinks it, which is very interesting. In another book, Dr. Michael Ruscio, he said that excessive stress, negatively impacts literally every part of our body. And he talks about this in his book, Healthy Gut, Healthy You. The worst part of it all is that the fact that the systems of our mind and body, they get used to the state of maladaptive stress responses. Remember earlier I mentioned neurons that fire together, wire together. So the maladaptive stress response is now your default state, and that is why healing from trauma gets quite challenging. So now we have a good understanding of how our nervous system is affected by stress and trauma, but how do we reset that nervous system? Here are some steps, but there's always a catch within each step, which is why we have the pitfalls that we do when we're trying to heal ourselves. So we must be really aware of them and develop counteractive psychotechnologies in order to get to a transformed state of self. And this takes time and effort. So the first is to have awareness. Take a moment to stop these frantic or unhelpful thoughts and be aware of them. examine how they are triggered, and ask yourself, how did I get into this state? Now, once you're able to stop these thoughts in their tracks, the moment you recognize that they're hijacking your mind, you're actually retraining those tightly wired neurons not to fire as quickly as they would. And the more regularly and more deliberately you do that, the weaker these connections become over time. So you end up rewiring your neurons to instinctively behave differently. So if you think about muscle memory, it takes a lot of conscious work initially, but over time, you're conditioning these patterns. Now, what's really important is that you have to remember that you don't have to identify with these thought patterns. You've learned them in some way or form at some time, but they don't have to be part of you and how you define yourself. And as we know, habits ultimately lead to change. And it is your adaptability to change that can define you better. But being overly cognitive about being aware and trying to change your thought patterns, or just noticing your thought patterns and getting too involved in that awareness and state of thinking, can be quite self-defeating. So we have to remember that overthinking can get you into a state of analysis paralysis, and then you'll get even more anxious about them. And this is where the next step comes in. With awareness and stopping these negative thoughts in its tracks, you have to couple that with mindfulness. Now, mindfulness isn't always about meditation or being mentally empty. So please remove that expectation from yourself. That is not what it is about. What it's about is actually being present and observant. It is what will help you change gears and weaken those patterns you want to unlearn. So essentially, mindfulness techniques calms your nervous system. This is where paying attention to your body is really important. Using our body, we reverse engineer our healing. We're contracting our body to do the work with us. The more comfortable and safe you feel in your body, the less the need for your mind to take over and try and do that. So engage in practices like yoga, specifically yin yoga, as this form of yoga is focused on the parasympathetic nervous system. You can look at martial arts such as Qigong, Tai Chi, or Taekwondo. These martial arts practices often are grounded in mindful and meditative philosophies and techniques. And the idea here is to understand the principle of mindfulness and integrate that into our healing practices. Not just do the practice and go back to our default maladaptive state. Other simple single task activities where you can implement mindfulness in your daily activities through your body is mindful eating, mindful gardening, mindful driving, just driving without listening to everything, without listening to anything, deep breathing, journaling, giving yourself a massage or going to get yourself a massage. The list goes on. And at this point, we can also dialogue with our emotions. Our emotional content is not to be ignored. And we can't actually think our way out of not feeling safe. We can't think our way out of anxiety or frustration or anger. It's very hard to rationalize ourselves out of an emotion. And if you're successful, I don't know how sustainable that is. And it is because of that, you might have heard phrases like feel your feelings or acknowledge your feelings, don't push them away. Because what happens is when we push them away, we're actually pushing them into a part of our body and we're suppressing it like a pressure cooker. So idea here is we have to get into a state where we actually feel differently. And again, that takes time. How do we feel differently? Well, we got to digest our emotions. And how do we do that? Well, one proven way is journaling or some other form of expressive therapies like talking about it. So we have talking therapy like counseling, having a dialogue with our emotions or about our emotions. And this can actually give these emotions a voice. And often that's what's lacking with trauma, these big emotions that are rendered silent. Sometimes we can even locate the area of the body where our emotion resides, whether we feel a sinking feeling in our chest or a discomfort in our shoulders, suddenly when we're being triggered or aroused by an external stimulus, our hands and feet start feeling really clammy. And in these cases, a body scan can really be helpful for this exercise. So the more we acknowledge and allow ourselves to be curious about what our body is telling us, the more likely we are to listen to what it's trying to tell us. Ultimately, emotional pain or discomfort often sets up shop and resides in our physical body. Now, for the last step, the lasting change, we have to transform our relationship with ourselves, with our body. We have to address two things: insufficient self-love and insufficient feeling of safety. At some point of our lives, we more often when we're younger, actually, we are somewhat starved of love. So we feel that we need to achieve some great feat in order to achieve the appraisal or the love that we need. And when we're not performing, we are not on edge because somewhere deep inside our brain, there's a strange belief that when I do this, or when I finish that or complete that, then I am worthy. But worthy of what exactly? Now, this is not to say that we have awful parents who didn't love us. I can say for a fact that my parents love the crap out of me, but we can have parents that love us and sacrifice themselves to give us everything, but they may have lacked the skills in providing us with the emotional and physical love that we needed for optimal development at our early days. So there are some very deep questions that come up here, and revelations too, when we pay attention to them. They're critical and worth thinking about. We often have some form of intuition at this point when processing this. And this is where the transformation actually occurs, that long-lasting, meaningful change that you seek within yourself. And the real change happens when we address these underlying issues and reconnect with ourselves. As much as we can talk to our spouses, our family members, our therapists, and even our exes about our past, we have to be able to reconfigure our relationship with ourselves differently to when we experienced them in our childhood, whether we were dismissed, whether we were neglected, or whether we were overly critiqued. So by resetting your nervous system, you are also transforming your relationship with yourself. If you recall the psychotechnologies or techniques I mentioned before, you'll also realize that these practices allow for you to reconnect with your values. There are many other tools and processes that you can do to achieve this, but ultimately keep on top of how you relate with yourself regularly, whilst implementing these tools or these techniques that help retrain your brain and your nervous system. So do the things that you need to do, but keep in mind that you need to check in with yourself and your relationship with yourself simultaneously. Now, there are tons and tons of other tools and psychotechnologies out there. So please comment below and share what you've tried, what's worked for you and what didn't work for you. And I hope this video has been helpful. I look forward to learning more from you. And because it's Christmas and the end of the year, I wish everyone happy holidays and enjoy your time with your family and your loved ones. That's all for now. Bye-bye.